Hi, this is Dr. Jonathan Terry. I'm presenting today, sharing with you a sample of a presentation I've been asked to give tomorrow for a school in the Fresno area where I'll be speaking to faculty and staff there. And the topic is on adult social and emotional learning, specifically emotional regulation, empathy, and how that can impact professional relationships in a school setting. Many aspects of this presentation are going to have kind of a local Fresno flair, but I'm going to try to universalize it just a little bit more for those of you who are interested in that adult social emotional learning and some different directions that we might take on those, particularly from my perspective as a board certified psychiatrist. Now, I'd be remiss to start a presentation without including a photo of my amazing dog. This is Noodle Terry. Noodle has his own Instagram, which he is very excited about. And this is a picture of him around Christmas time in front of Community Regional Medical Center. That's the trauma center in the Fresno area. And Noodle, you can't see very well here, but he's wearing Santa on his back. And this dog is actually a certified therapy dog. My wife has done an incredible job getting him ready for training, and he actually has even more hospital badges than I do because he goes to all these different hospitals. He helps patients, he helps the staff. And one of the things that I want to highlight in this presentation are the ways that actually social and emotional learning is somewhat inherent to dogs, but something that we as humans have to think a little bit more about. In his line of work, Noodle Terry gets some absolutely ridiculous photos. This is actually a photo of him wearing a holiday wreath that was sent to us, and you can see a lot of things here without any words being spoken. So much of social and emotional learning is being able to understand nonverbals, and when you look at this dog who was asked to take this picture, what are some things that come to mind? What is this dog communicating with you, and how can we as humans stop and understand a little bit about what's going on with a person just by observing facial expressions and nonverbals? I know you've got the point here at this point already in the presentation. Just 2 minutes into it, you're saying, okay, cool, he's got a dog. We've seen some dog pictures. But the connection between social and emotional learning actually happened on a drive yesterday when I was talking about this presentation, talking about some different ideas. And my wife is pictured on the left in the first picture and with the dog in the third picture on the slide. And my wife Elizabeth, who's been the primary trainer for Noodle Terry with all of his therapy dog visits, all the things he does, she said to me, well, it's funny that humans have to pause and think about these things because dogs do it naturally. They engage, they read the room, they have mechanisms for calming themselves down and kind of measuring their own space or just being themselves and being in touch with their emotions and knowing what's happening in sort of their very true dog way. Lots to think about here, lots to unpack, but this was really fun for me to make this comparison. I started this presentation and I haven't told you a whole lot about me yet, right? And so this school audience is a new audience for me. But I wanted to emphasize that, of course, a lot of my presentation is going to come from my role as a board-certified psychiatrist, somebody who thinks about the brain and the ways that we relate to each other all the time. But the school I'm presenting at is a TK through 8 school, and this is the school that I work at most of the time. This is California Health Sciences University, where I currently serve as a professor and assistant dean. And we teach about 650 doctoral level students and a smaller number of master's level students in the setting. And I would argue that social and emotional learning, something that's really been put into TK through 8 classrooms, is every bit as important with our adult learners and with adults as well. And this is a good time to remind you that in this presentation, I'm primarily talking about adult audiences and the ways that we as adults can understand perhaps a little bit more about our emotions, the ways that we think about things, the ways we project. As one example of that contrast, this is the exact same building, just a different view, but what we're doing here is we're looking at it at night. And again, you might notice some of the subtle inferences, the things that we feel in ourselves looking at the same image. This is a place that I spend a lot of time at, and I can tell you when I'm there in the daytime, it feels different to me than when I'm there at night. And those are things to keep in mind because part of social and emotional learning is understanding our environment, understanding the preconceptions and things that we bring to the table. Where is our attention drawn? Where are we at ourselves and how are our emotions before we enter a place or a situation? Within my role as an educator, as I'm sure many of the educators listening to this might relate, we go through such a wide range of emotions throughout our days. On the left, I have a picture with the Fresno State mascot. That's Victor E. Bulldog in an incredibly expressive pose. We were hanging out. We were having a good time. And you can see, again, just looking at this image, some of the emotions that might be felt, some of the nonverbals. The image on the right is at our graduation, graduating a new physician, somebody who I've known for 4+ years across incredibly challenging situations and difficult patient studies, walking across that finish line, and just the joy and that feeling that is inherent to this moment. Again, checking in with ourselves, having that emotion to know where we are at in the room, because what we bring to the table is going to indicate and shift the ways that we can address our learners and the other adults and staff around us. Now, that feeling of absolute joy that was in the Save Mart Center, the giant 20,000 seat basketball arena here at Fresno State University. And the feeling there is so much different than this image, what I was feeling talking to a group of physicians. And even though it's something that I'm competent in, something I practice every day, going in front of this audience is something that makes me feel differently in my body, in my mind, as I'm communicating. And I'm more mindful of the ways that I might feel, noticing the audience that I have there, or the audience that I have today, right? The ways that I might be thinking, gosh, what is this group thinking about me, and how do they perceive physicians, psychiatrists, other educators, people who wear a suit on 100+ degree days in Fresno? There's so much that's going on in the room. And if we, again, just need to pause, reflect, and see where we are at, whenever we are talking to someone new, engaging with a student, engaging with a coworker, knowing where we are at first is so important and critical to the learning objectives of this conversation. Now, in the daytime presentation, we're going to be talking after lunch, but this isn't part of the activity that could be applied to any session. And what this is a re-engagement, saying, okay, before we turn the lens inward and talk about this adult social emergent and emotional learning, let's see where we're at already. And that might be checking in to say, do you have any aha moments or strategies regarding student social emotional learning, or even the understanding of how neurobiology relates to this topic? A second topic, a second prompt could be, how does that connect to how we as adults feel and function during the school day? This is designed as a breakout exercise where groups or individuals can work in their table groups again, or as dyads, however best fits the room, to communicate back and get people talking a little bit before we get a chance to dive into the topics deeper together. Finally, 10 slides into this deck is when we are going to take a look at what the actual learning objectives are. Now, you notice I set this up differently, and this is to mirror social and emotional learning, which is different than a strictly cognitive or a lecture approach where I would come in with my slide deck, say, these are the learning objectives, this is what we're doing. What I did to you first was I appealed to your humanity and mine. I gave you some emotions and some different things in my life so that you could see me as a person. And that is something that I would challenge you to do as you work with your groups. Let them see who you are, let them be able to connect at a different level. And then once we've done that, now we are finally ready to take a look at our roadmap, take a look at our learning objectives. In part 1 of this conversation, we're going to dive into the neurobiology of adult stress. We'll talk about the pro-social classroom model, how stress can be contagious among educators, and how we might do some cognitive reappraisal when we're under acute pressure. In the second part of this talk, we're going to take a look at empathy, looking at what that means at several different levels, as well as de-escalation techniques. Finally, we'll take a look at our professional relationships as they relate to an educational setting. As our final objective, participants should be able to leave this conversation with at least 2 actionable emotion regulation techniques that are rooted in a deeper understanding of neurophysiology, have a deeper framework for peer empathy, as well as finally a concrete plan that might strengthen the professional culture, specifically within their TK through 8 educational teams. All right, so let's get going. We're going to talk about brains. And now if these were my med students, we'd be looking at this imaging together. We'd say, hey, is this a CT? Is this an MRI? What type of slice is this? We're not going to do that today. But we are going to take a look in general at how neurophysiology plays a role in social and emotional learning, and how those same neurotransmitter pathways govern the classroom climate, staff well-being, and how physiologic stress can be contagious. Now, if this were a talk, again, with a live audience, we take a look at this image together, and I like to ask the audience, what is going on in this image? What do you see? Some people describe things of great joy, of release. Others see things that are much more dark and maybe even end-of-life topics. There's so much that's going on here. And what we're getting at is how our own neuroimaginal world, our own perceptions, allow us to look at an image, the same image that the person next to us is looking at, and perceive something totally differently. And that type of open-mindedness is something that we need with our learners as well as with each other. This next slide is when I show a video that's called Atmospheres. And for copyright purposes, I'm not going to share that video here in this specific recording. However, it is publicly available on YouTube, and you can search for this video called Atmospheres. And what this is it is a 60-second video that shows the same exact video footage, the visual footage, the first 30 seconds and the second 30 seconds. What's different is in the first 30 seconds, it has jarring music. It's this cab that's driving around New York, and there's music, and it's very stressful, very high-strung. And then in the second 30 seconds, it is to beautiful concert music. And you see this incredible landscape, the symphony of things going on in a day in Manhattan. And it's just beautiful to watch. And the only thing that's different is that background music. What we're making a case here is that we can have the same exact situation, but our perception changes everything. And we need to think about how we do this in our own lives. And finally take a look at perhaps why we should make an effort to do exactly that. This draws into concept, this idea of the neuroimaginal world. And this is something that Rick Hansen and Rick Mendius wrote about in a book I love called Buddha's Brain. And this idea is that much of what we see out there, the things we perceive as being external to ourselves, are actually in here, within ourselves. We see that actually a very small amount of our memory is generated by our outside world, by that input from the senses. Most of our memory is actually from our perceptions, from our practice perceptions, from the stories that we've told ourselves. And that includes things like implicit memory, our expectations for the world, our models of relationship, our own emotional tendencies, our general outlook. One example of this is if you put people into a sensory deprivation chamber, in which a person floats on warm salt water in a completely dark and silent space. If a person stays in there long enough, the brain actually will start to hallucinate imagery just to have new information to process, just to be in that space. We see it as well with the inhumanity in many ways of solitary confinement and how that applies in correctional settings. The brain wants to be active, and it's going to create things based upon what it already knows and what it has already experienced. One of my mentors was the late psychiatrist Dr. Jan Fawcett, who was one of the foremost experts in bipolar disorder, just a really incredible person. And he spoke about this idea, an image that I'll show you a little bit later, this idea of this reptile brain, where most of what we're working with in our brains is actually the same stuff that lizards are working with. It's this very sort of fear avoidant system, where if we look psychologically at everything being a motivator, either a carrot, some type of reward, or a stick, something that's a consequence or something painful, our ancestors appropriately paid way more attention to the sticks than the carrots. And because of that, they lived, which was great, but they ended up sharing these same avoidance genes with you and me. And we see it in terms of, even with kids, when they're building things, when they're going out in the backyard. We see this across cultures. They build forts, they build blanket caves, they go hide in tree houses, right? They want this place, similar to, for those of you who have cats, where they can sit on a high place and see everything. And so we have this idea of learned helplessness, where it's something where if a person has enough disappointments, it's easy for them to say, to almost go to this nihilistic place and say that everything's going to go bad. And it's hard to undo once a person has that. And people will actually do more behaviorally to avoid a loss. If they have to take a gamble and they might lose 50 cents or gain 50 cents, they're going to do much more to avoid that loss than to potentially gain the same amount. We also see that in studies, if people are shown fearful faces on a series of faces, they can name that emotion and they can perceive and react to that fear much more quickly than happy or neutral ones. And we notice that this is the same even in primate species, that we are so attuned to being able to recognize not just these feelings in ourselves, but also in others. And that's part of what we'll talk about in a little bit with the contagious factor of cultural aspects at work and beyond. I have a couple of very simplified brain images that I'll be showing you. And this is an example where if you have a person, for example, who's been bit by a dog before, and they see a dog, and here we've got this just absolutely terrifying sort of Jack Russell looking dog here. And when a person sees that dog, they recognize it as a dog, and the amygdala, this part of the brain that's responsible for emotions, for intensity, for fear, it ends up sounding the alarms, which actually activate all these downstream autonomic nervous system, these stress hormones. They say, hey, it's time to go. This is scary. We have the emotional perception of this being terrible. And it ends up actually shutting off our ability to think more broadly of, I don't know this dog. This dog might be fine. The dog is across the room. The dog's not going to hurt me. We can't enter that cognitive space once the amygdala starts sounding that alarm. And this absolutely happens in our settings at work as well, where perhaps non-compliance from a student who's given instructions or peer conflict from a coworker is perceived as an immediate survival threat if this is something that has riled us up before. And we end up having these sort of fight or flight responses. And it impacts our ability, where our prefrontal cortex, the front part of our brain, our most evolved part, that would allow us to reason and have meaningful understandings of things, it actually shuts it down. And our impulse control, our working memory, those things end up really taking a hit, where the ability to reappraise a situation of saying, hey, this person who's mad, maybe they're just overwhelmed, maybe it's not about me. We lose our ability to reappraise things, and it just becomes this place of sort of very emotional fear where we avoid things, or we ourselves become combative and argumentative in these cases. Now, I have a couple very wordy slides in here, and even as we talk about social and emotional learning, check in with yourself, see what it's like when you see a bunch of words and big words on a slide. That's intentional. There's going to be alternating a bit with wordy slides and less wordy slides as we're going through this hour or so long experiment, focusing on ourselves and seeing our own reactions, our own responses to things. Now, this slide talks in words through what was just described, but it adds a little bit more to it. And one of, I think, the key things to think about with social emotional learning is this idea of anticipation, where even if we just anticipate a challenging event, whether it's a class we don't want to teach, a performance review, a presentation, a call, that can actually have as much impact as living through the event for real. We've measured that the amygdala that I spoke about before in the medial temporal lobe of the brain, it sends out an alarm. And the thalamus, kind of a smaller brain within the brain, this sort of center for different signaling, it sends a wake-up signal, releasing norepinephrine from the limbic system. It goes to the major organs, the major muscle groups. Hypothalamus begins sending endocrine signals to the pituitary and adrenal glands. Epinephrine's released, cortisol is released. This cortisol, in turn, stimulates the amygdala further, and more cortisol is produced. You end up with this incredible cycle of sort of the gas pedal just being activated and reactivated until we feel exhausted. And this cortisol that's being released actually from the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys, well, it comes and it suppresses hippocampal activity. And the hippocampus in the brain is kind of this area that's right next to this emotional center, but the hippocampus is in charge of memory integration, and it can also put a bit of a pause on the amygdala. So the amygdala itself, as we mentioned, even from earlier times, it's hardwired to focus on this negative information and to react so intensely in this fight or flight response. It gets sensitized to being activated, and it actually will lower its threshold for future anxiety. So state anxiety of, I'm anxious about this meeting, I'm anxious about talking to this parent, I'm concerned about this student, I don't like this coworker. Those things become trait anxiety after enough time, where a person actually, it becomes a part of their person. It's interesting because mental activity actually has more direct effect on the autonomic nervous system than any other bodily system. And that ends up setting us up for, the stress sets us up for fear and anger because we're already revved up, we're already going 100 miles an hour. It helps to describe how victims of trauma, they might feel dissociated from an event. They don't want to think about it, but they are still so reactive to the triggers of that same event. And this can lead to feeling upset or guarded a lot of the time without knowing exactly why. And it's so important for us to think about that as we live in a pedal to the metal society where we have this nonstop activation. And so in treating panic or anxiety or stress as a psychiatrist, this is where education about what's going on in the brain, this worrying about the future, this regretting the past, all those things have to be taken into account before we can really address what's going on with a person or a student or a coworker. I love this image here on the right of this reptile brain I was speaking about, and then maybe it looks like there's a possum just a little bit up, and then you got sort of this primate space in the brain, and then really the sort of prefrontal and frontal area of the dolphin, these higher, more developed brains. But what that means for us as humans is, unlike the reptile who just gets spooked about a thing and runs under the bush and then we're back to the beginning, we get to worry about the future. We get to regret the past. We get to blame ourselves for the present. And this bias within ourselves, it can decrease our own self-awareness. It can decrease our ability for contemplation. And so our resources end up getting shifted from long-term projects, things the body and brain need to work on, building immunity, fostering relationships, having a great mood, toward more short-term crises. But that has long-term consequences, right? We see it spill out into autoimmune disease, into gastrointestinal disorders, or our bowel habits. Anybody who has a dog, you know we are checking the dog's emotions and how stressed they are every single time, and it's not from their behavior. It's from what they leave in the yard. It can have cardiovascular effects, endocrine and neurologic. These are things that we need to think about with our students, again, with our coworkers, not why are you behaving this way, but more of a perspective of what happened to you to help get to this point, and how do we undo it. This is looking at it at an individual level. We're going to take a look next at it from a more group level. When we look at things from more of a group level, we can say that there's really, for better or for worse, as a survival mechanism, there's no primate species without aggressive tendencies in both male and female primates. And we see this when, unfortunately, in so many aspects of human behavior. We see it in schoolyard cliques, we see it in bullying, we see it in office politics, domestic violence, international politics. There's all these power plays that play a role, and there sort of becomes this us versus them thing where groups throughout history, and certainly in animal species, that take care of us and kind of have this us versus them, this fear of the unknown, fear of other groups. Those groups tended to survive. But that's not necessarily realistic in an interconnected and co-dynamic workplace or the ways that we work with children. We want all of our learners to be able to appreciate each other for who they are and as individuals without categorizing or lumping someone perhaps as, oh, this person is not like me. They're not of my social background, not my style. Catch ourselves throughout the day of the number of ways that we look at somebody and we might pass a judgment of something about a person without ever having known that person. There's this expression by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in each person's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm any hostility. So we have to take a look at our own suffering, at the emotions, the things that really grind our gears during the day. And we have to wonder, okay, is my suffering in this case, is it acute? Is it just about this thing? Or is it chronic? Is it something about the way that I relate to the world that's causing me to feel this way? Or causing me to interact this way with a learner or with a parent or with a coworker? And having words for our emotions can be really important. This is something that I work on psychotherapeutically all the time. Is it loneliness? Is it dismay? Is it stress? Is it hurt? Is it anger? Is it trauma? Is it anguish? And what's going on in the background? Is it the day starting totally neutral, or are we increasingly waking up on the wrong side of the bed with a background sense of anxiety and irritability or a lack of fulfillment? Remembering that if we do take a look at neural networks, if we were to look at different functional imaging for the brain, social and emotional pain of being othered, being an outsider, being part of a disadvantaged group, these act on the same neural networks as physical pain. One of the books, The Body Keeps the Score, speaks so much about this. Envy and jealousy also go down those same pathways. And so we have this psychological term, this idea of demand characteristics. And those are things that really pull us. It's a situation that causes us to respond a certain way. And this is a bit philosophical, a bit therapeutic, but if we think about a situation, I missed the bus, I got an email, I got a bill in the mail, I stubbed my toe. Most situations are inherently neutral, but we end up making these demands and these associations in our own neuroimaginal perceptive world. Think of it this way. When a doorbell rings, how does that make us feel? I can tell you how that makes my dog feel. When a person reaches out their hand to shake our hand, what reaction do we have to that? All of these things are demand characteristics where when presented with a stimulus, we are conditioned to have a response. Pay attention to the number of times in our day that becomes a factor. This is an imaginal activity, and what I'm going to ask you to do, shut your eyes if you want, it might help with this exercise, but we're going to consider this slightly adapted parable from the Taoist teacher Chung Tzu, which I've updated a little bit. Imagine that you are relaxing in a canoe on a river, when suddenly there's a hard thump against the side and you're dumped, you spill into the river, your boat is capsized, you are wet, you come up sputtering, and you see that there's a couple teenagers with snorkels that they snuck up and they tipped you over. How does that feel? Now we return to that same situation. Everything's the same. You're in the canoe, and unfortunately you end up in the river. But this time when you come up, you realize that there's actually a submerged log that drifted downstream. It smacked into your canoe. Does that feel different? Now, as we look at that, would we say that most people in our lives, most of the people that we have problems with, are they more like the teenagers or more like the logs? Perhaps it leaves a bit up to you to decide, but I think that it's wise for many people to maybe get out of their way if you can, reduce the impact. But a lot of times they're not aiming at you. It's like that atmospheres video that we spoke about, or that we'll be watching in the live session of this, where it's the exact same scenario, 30 seconds to hostile music, 30 seconds to relaxing music. That background noise is everything. Rick Hansen spoke about getting upset with somebody's thoughts is like getting upset about the spray from a waterfall. One of the neatest things about brains is they are constantly rewiring. They're constantly reworking to make us adapt and learn to our environment. And Dan Siegel, who is a professor of psychiatry at UCLA, author of The Mindful Brain, says that the mind uses the brain to make the mind. That relates, I think, a little bit to something every medical student learns from Dr. Donald Hebb, H-E-B-B, and they learn about this thing called Hebb's Law, which is essentially neuroplasticity, saying that when neurons fire together, they wire together. What that means is that mental activity creates new neural structures. And the longer something's held in awareness, the more emotionally stimulating it is, the more neurons that fire, the more they wire together, and the stronger that traces in the memory. So atoms in our bodies are literally replaced in this exact moment, even as we speak, making new ones. The energy that we use to eat and drink, it comes from sunshine. It goes through the food chain, right? There's this constant exchange. We can even go back to say we're all here because a lot of stars blew up, right? We're all the same stuff. And sometimes we lose sight of that. There's this expression that you are what you eat. But what if you're also what you think? Some of the things that we notice and the ways that we see this playing out is that taxi drivers in London, they end up developing a larger hippocampus as part of the brain responsible for memory and meaningful integration and visuospatial circuitry compared to people who aren't navigating streets all day. In blind people, some occipital regions that are designed for visual processing can actually be rezoned to have a greater ability for auditory function. This synaptic change, this reinforcement, we think about nerves as fixed structures, but really the evidence says that's so far from the case, as synaptic change from neuron to neuron can actually be seen in milliseconds. So how do we get there? Right? I talked with you about this whole reptile brain thing, and when we get scared, it shuts off our ability for our brain to brain. Well, it's actually going to draw on this top-down regulation from the parts of the brain that are more evolved, and that can be parts of the prefrontal cortex, this kind of top-down calming. And interestingly, those upper levels of our brain, the parts we can train, the parts that can learn to play the piano and speak a foreign language, those have much greater neuroplasticity than the lower ones. They're just kind of wired the way they are. We might think about the anterior cingulate cortex, which is kind of this part in the front part of the brain that's associated with obsessive compulsive disorder, but also things like compassion. And as one becomes happier, different parts of the brain, the left frontal lobe, parts of the brain that we use actually in transcranial magnetic stimulation as a depression treatment, this part of the brain becomes more active. We see more activity there. And we see that virtue, this idea of virtuous acts and calm and meditation and prayer, similar topics are present in all major faiths. How is that? How did that come to be? That before we had the ability to measure these things, people would begin to practice and explore these ideas to cultivate compassion and strengthen that underlying neural substrate in areas of the brain, the anterior cingulate, the insula. It takes time to practice these things. And one spiritual practice says that it takes time to become what we already are. This is not a talk about meditation, but for any of you, for example, who are Kaiser Permanente members, you might know that your membership with Kaiser includes a subscription to an app for meditation. And why would Kaiser spend our healthcare dollars doing that? Well, because it turns out there's tons of evidence for it. We see that for experienced Tibetan practitioners in deep meditation, they can change their brainwaves. Meditation increases gray matter in key parts of the brain. All these psychological functions can improve. This isn't a talk, again, about meditation or medication for that matter, but it is about training that brain to do the things we want it to do and not the things that we're led to do through that lizard brain. This isn't just for those who lead a highly spiritual life. No, this is about educators in a TK through 8 setting who need to take a moment to step back, check in with themselves, and see where they're at before going into the difficult thing. I'll quote Walt Whitman in his Song of the Open Road, where he said, "I'm larger, better than I thought. I did not know I held so much goodness." For those of you who are visual learners, think about what we can actively do to pull some weeds and instead plant some flowers in their place. Again, the power of positive emotions is present in all sorts of different measurable quantities. Stronger immune system, more resilient cardiovascular system, going against painful experiences, decreasing cortisol, lifting mood, increasing optimism, helping asthma, type 2 diabetes, PMS, chronic pain. There are so many important things where not only does it alter it in the moment, but we actually see that it may even alter epigenetically gene expression and reduce the cellular damage associated with chronic stress. So where does this play a role in the workplace, right? You can say, hey, I'm going to take care of my own business, but what about Susie? Susie is always worked up and I can't handle working with Susie. Well, actually, you doing your work is going to make things better for Susie, and if Susie can do her work too, it's going to be better for you and everybody else around. Let me tell you a little bit about that. If we were to say within ourselves the one purpose of neurons, you can arguably say it's about communication. And if the fibers of our insides are made for communication, the fibers of our outsides are not so different. I challenge you again to think about all the ways we communicate with each other. Even Darwin would say that all sentient beings develop through natural selection in such a way that pleasant sensations serve as their guide, especially the pleasure derived from sociability and from loving our families. And primates, who roughly appeared about 80 million years ago, their defining characteristic that made them perhaps even different from other mammals was the degree of sociability that they had. Monkeys and apes, they might spend up to 1/6 of their day grooming other members of their troop. And interestingly, in one species study, the Barbary macaques, the groomers, the ones that were doing the grooming, not the ones receiving the grooming, but the ones doing it, they received more stress relief and more balanced nervous system than those who were on the receiving end of the grooming. We have these incredible tools in our brains, these ideas of spindle cells and mirror neurons that are really only present in the great apes. So that's your chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, and humans that have this type of neuron that supports these advanced social capabilities. And these spindle cells that are found in the cingulate cortex, the insula, they indicate that these functions of empathy and self-awareness, They've experienced this intense evolutionary pressure over the last several million years to give us the ability to do something more. And mirror neurons are exactly what they sound like. There are these networks in the brain's perceptual motor systems that light up when a person performs an action or when you see someone else perform that action. So if I stand in front of the audience and I wave at you, the part of your brain responsible for waving just activated as well. Sorry, I didn't get consent, but that's what happens all day long. Now, when you have strong emotions, such as fear or anger, those can also light up when you have those feelings, it lights up those emotions for others and vice versa. So interestingly, although we talked about epinephrine, norepinephrine, sort of these fight or flight hormones, it can also play a role with oxytocin, with endorphins, with vasopressin, these chemicals inside of us that are responsible in the neurochemistry of bonding, of love, these things that create feelings of caring and cherishing. These are present in eye contact, and interestingly, oxytocin, which is used as a treatment for people with autism spectrum disorder, can in all people, it can increase trust, it can dampen that amygdala arousal, and it can promote approach-type behaviors that tend to support befriending behaviors and help to eliminate stress. So if we go back to the classroom, and we're going to practice here with an exercise in just a minute, if we go back to the classroom, there's this idea of the pro-social classroom. And what this is a theoretical framework that highlights how teachers' social emotional competence and well-being support teacher-student relationships, effective classroom management, and successful social emotional learning. That in turn creates a positive classroom climate that can boost student academic achievement and reduce teacher burnout. What a cool thing to have a pro-social classroom. That also plays a role with the physiologic contagion, in the sense that if teachers are calm, well, students have a much greater likelihood of being calm and being in a place where they can receive and practice learning as well. Student cortisol levels have been studied to directly correlate with teacher burnout rates. Now, is it a chicken or the egg situation? Arguably, I think it's both. Stressed students create stressed teachers and vice versa. And one of the ways that we need to look at this, again, as educators, is thinking about our own regulation as an anchoring point. An emotionally regulated adult is essentially an external nervous system stabilizer for students who may not have that at home, as well as for colleagues. So here's a quick activity for partners to practice here in the classroom with us. When this is done in live lecture format, partners will spend minutes first individually reflecting on specific school day triggers and then discussing with the partner. They should pay attention to physical markers. What signals alert a person that their nervous system is going into that sympathetic activation, that fight or flight response? For some people, it's a tight chest, jaw clenching, shallow breathing. What do they feel? And then what triggers it? Is it transitions? Is it the bell ringing? Is it peer conflict, administrative meetings? Is it parent communications? And then how does a person regulate that? What micro interventions can a person use or do they use to slow down? And this is a chance to reflect back to the group and really see what works for people. That was a long part one, which is most of this talk, is really getting an idea of that neural biology behind what's happening, having a framework to structurally understand what's happening in social emotional learning and how we apply that in the classroom. So in this next section, we're actually going to take a deeper dive into empathy, into relational attunement, and how to kind of navigate that to prevent compassion fatigue and applying this attunement across our TK through 8th grade staff interactions. I'm going to give you a little bit more vocab to start off with here. And we talk about empathy. Empathy is great. It allows you to feel what another person is feeling and understand it, and it's better than sympathy and all these things. But we need to break that down between cognitive empathy and affective empathy. Now, effective empathy is what we might be feeling more often. We're viscerally taking on another person's distress. And when we take on a person's distress in that level, imagine if when I'm working in the emergency room, if I took on the stress and the pain that was going on around me, I could not do my job. And we see that as well with educators, where they might take on the traumas and the issues that are going on in their coworkers and with their students, and it leads to compassion fatigue, especially in high needs educational settings. Now, that's much different than the slightly more detached but still very present cognitive empathy, where we're intellectually understanding and taking another's perspective, but it's without absorbing the emotional overwhelm. And that's the piece that's much more essential for sustainable long-term educator well-being. Now, how do we do that? Well, a big part of it is going to be validating. It's going to be when you see that colleague or student who's dysregulated, it's going to be saying, okay, I need to step back and being a logical place and increasing that resistance to validate that emotional experience at first. I see how overwhelming this transition is. I can imagine how stressful this thing at home for you must have been. Things like that, where you are sensitive to what's going on, you're validating how the other person feels, but you yourself don't need to feel it to be effective. And as I mentioned, communication is not just verbal, right? It's about how we look. It's about our nonverbal calm. It's lowering our vocal pitch, slowing our tempo, and maintaining soft eye contact, where we are not going to be causing a person who's already activated to become even more activated. Now, that of course can include healthy relational boundaries. Having empathy does not mean accepting abusive behavior. And having good boundaries with students or coworkers can actually help to protect the professional relationship, to maintain clear psychological safety standards across all school teams. All right, it's time for another exercise. This is going to be a paired role play, ideally with a different partner than before, but if it's the same partner, that's fine too. And we're going to go through two different scenarios. The first one is with a totally dysregulated other teacher or staff member. And this is another teacher enters your room during planning time. They are anxious and frustrated about something that's going on. And you're going to listen to them. You're going to practice validating without absorbing the panic itself and without overly relating or taking it on as your own problem. The second scenario, if we perhaps switch roles, is working with a parent or a caregiver, where a parent is really upset and defensive about some behavioral consequence that happened to their kid. Here you're going to practice cognitive empathy. You're going to practice using that vocal tone that's a little bit lower, a little bit more methodical, while also setting clear professional boundaries. I like to allow about 10 minutes or so for this exercise, and if it's a small enough room, float around the room a little bit and see how folks are doing. Our third and final dive is going to be taking a look at staff relationships, about how we build trust, psychological safety, and collective adult social emotional competence across our TK through 8 teams. This topic could be a training all into itself. And where we're going with this is when staff feel safe acknowledging their mistakes or asking for help without fear of peer or supervisor judgment, that can do incredible things for trust and for building out the workplace as a safe place to be who we are and to grow together. When we notice that others around us, when we can be confident in our colleagues' professional skills and have shared alignment with student well-being, that also helps a school be a more trusting and safe place to work. Finally, personal regard is something that some of us do really well and some of us perhaps do a little bit less well. In terms of being able to demonstrate genuine care for colleagues as whole humans, being curious about what's going on with them as people and outside of work, and what are they bringing to the table each day. That helps to buffer against systemic burnout. In the sense of when we notice that somebody is struggling, it's okay and encouraged to check in with them, using these tools that we have, again, that sort of cognitive empathy, to be there for them. You don't have to take on the problem, but you do have an appropriate role in caring about a person, about their well-being, and being really genuine about it. There are a number of different ways that we might use to get there. One is shifting our staff meetings. You'll remember with this presentation, I didn't start by giving you an agenda or goals. I started by telling you about my dog, right? I let you have a little bit of humanity. And sometimes team meetings, it might feel a little cheesy at first, but notice how it shifts your team meetings. Checking in with a 2-minute emotional temperature check. What's going on with people? What's your mood meter? Where are you on a 0 to 10, 10 being the best mood ever and 0 being the worst, either really down or depleted? And that might help to normalize adult emotional literacy and also help you know your audience or where everybody's at with a meeting. It might also help you allow, as a supervisor or as a coworker, seeing who you might need to check in with or who might not be ready to have whatever the focus deliverable is done on time. You can establish coverage signal systems. And what that is are different peer co-regulation. If you notice somebody is really upset, get that permission to, as a group, as a staff, as a faculty team, to say, hey, we need a 3-minute breather. Can we do that? And then get to the task at hand, if it's safe to do so at that time. We also want to have appropriate meetings where we can give feedback in psychologically safe ways, where a person can rate their own performance perhaps, or different things, and then invite that feedback from a supervisor. In my own practice, I like to use principles from motivational interviewing or motivational enhancement therapy. That's a whole separate conversation and training, but it's something that I think is really valuable. And so in order to build emotionally safe environments for children at our schools, the adults themselves need to exist in an environment that has emotional safety, appreciation, and peer trust. It's time for another exercise, and this one can be 5 or 10 minutes, and what this involves is working in department teams, if there are teams, or even, again, in table groups. Ideally, it's great if people who kind of work closely together can get together and come up with, within their groups, 2 concrete adult social and emotional learning commitments for the team. And one way to do that is to come up with individual or peer goals of how one might support another one during moments of acute stress or dysregulation during the school day. How am I as an individual going to do this? And then another one looking more at the team culture. What ritual or communication norm are we going to try to do in staff meetings to maintain or foster psychological safety or trust? And then each team can have a representative to report back to the full group. This is about creating a safe place to share these ideas and practice what we're doing in real time. When we practice at a cultural staff level, regulating our nervous systems, cultivating empathy, perspective, nurturing professional trust, we can build a thriving and sustainable educational community. Now, I started our conversation with a dog, and I'm going to end with more or less end. I'm going to gear us toward the end with another dog. This is Mabel. Mabel's the dog. Josh is the boy. Mabel is likely long gone. This is an old image. And this comes out of research done at the Institute of Heart Math that looks at heart rate variability and different neat things. They're based in Ben Lomond, California, up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And when they were looking at some of their initial technology, they monitored Mabel the dog and Josh the person as they interacted with each other. And what you have here is Josh and Mabel. When they're in separate rooms, you end up with kind of this very rapid, asynchronous heart activity, which actually is low heart rate variability. We'll talk, well, that's a separate conversation, but it's less good than what happens when Josh enters the room and you see sort of this synchronization between Josh and Mabel's heart activity, which is really cool. It also has high heart rate variability. This is something that's really wonderful. And then Josh leaves the room. Terrible when you leave your dog and the dog is in the room wondering when you're coming back. And we see this change in both of their heart patterns when this is going on. We also see this type of synchronization when monitoring a couple that's been together for 50 years. This is monitoring them for a little bit of time overnight. And you can actually see the way that their heart patterns go together and the ways that they synchronize. Now, many of you are familiar with, say, an EKG that I can take in my office, right, where we apply electrodes to the chest and we can measure heart signals. Well, when we are using more sensitive technology or when we're minimizing outside interference, we, with current technology, can actually measure an EKG from across the room. We're generating this energy within ourselves, and it synchronizes with the people around us. And now that is a lot of responsibility in choosing how you choose to spend your time and who you spend your time with, as well as how we create the environments where we're sending all these signals out into the world and also receiving signals from others. This is more from the Institute of Heart Math used with permission. And what we have here, this actually is really interesting. We've got an EEG measuring brain waves in a pregnant mom, that's in blue. And we notice that actually synchronizes with baby's heart rate. This is, just one snapshot, but you can look at this across the rhythm strips. And we do see this synchronized connection. For those of us who are parents, maybe you can relate to this. I sometimes feel this with my dog. Lots to think about here. Perhaps one of the best examples of this is this image of what was called the rescuing hug. And before we had things going viral on the internet, this was one of those images that was there. This showed up in Time Magazine, Reader's Digest. Currently it's being used for a bunch of political purposes that we won't go into. But the rescuing hug here, it describes the first week of life of the set of twins that were in separate incubators. One of the twins was not doing well. And they kept them separated. Hospital nurse pushed back against hospital rules, put the babies together in one incubator as they had been prior to their preterm birth. And when they were placed together, the healthier baby threw an arm over her sister in this embrace. And the smaller baby's heart rate that was being measured with that pad there stabilized. The temperature improved. And to my understanding, both of the children survived, perhaps as a result of being placed together and being able to support each other. So, some thoughts to leave you with on compassion. Going back to the Beatles, the love we take, may it be equal to the love we make. Coldplay asks, am I part of the cure or am I part of the disease? Pema Chodron spoke of the root of compassion, being compassion for oneself. And Gloria Felt said, once we change our idea of power from power over to power to, we'll realize we have an infinite resource. So, some strategies that have come up here that we might consider. We heard from some strategies in the group. Taking a deep breath with a long exhalation. Approaching situations with equanimity, where we can be aware of our emotional activation, but choose not to respond to it. We've actually seen that practice documented on brain studies, on EEGs, to show this gamma wave synchronization of neurons across a large part of the brain when equanimity is practiced. Which is tough because the brain is not built for being neutral. We need to make that conscious effort. Finding oneness with another person. If it's someone that you're really frustrated with as an adult, take a step back and imagine how they might have been in their life to get to this point. Trying out the phrasing of, I love you anyhow. We don't have to say the anyhow part, but we can think it. Trying compassion, a compassion exercise for 5 people. A benefactor, someone who's helped you. A loved one or a friend. A neutral person, a difficult person. And finally, yourself. Being kind to aspects of yourself. Or practicing generosity when wronged. So it really challenges all of us to do all that you can, with all that you have, in the time that you have, in the place where you are. That quote comes from the late Nkosi Johnson, who was born Zolani Nkosi on February 4th, 1989, who lived till June 1st, 2001. Nkosi was a South African child with HIV and AIDS who made a powerful impact on public perceptions as of the pandemic, as well as its effects before his death at age 12. At the time of his death, he was the longest surviving HIV positive child who was born with HIV. I mentioned some of the references I have. These are some of my other references to some of the different images that I used, and a quick refresher on some of the things that we spoke about today. We spoke about the neurobiology of adult stress, took a look at a lot of the underlying neurological factors. We took a look at empathy, different types of empathy and how those might be used in de-escalation. And finally, we took a look at professional relationships, how those can be so important as places where we foster psychological safety, establish relational trust, and co-create supportive staff norms. My hope is that you're able to leave this conversation with several actionable emotional regulation techniques that are rooted in that neurophysiology, a deeper framework for peer empathy, and at least a beginning, if not a more developed plan, to strengthen professional culture within your teams. Thank you so much.